The lights in the ballroom were softened to a polite glow, the kind designed to flatter donors and calm executives who preferred their charity measured and controlled. It was 1968, Los Angeles, and everything about the evening had been rehearsed to feel safe. Safe speeches, safe smiles, safe generosity, wrapped in tuxedos and evening gowns. Even the applause had a rhythm. Warm, brief, professional. Dean Martin walked onto the stage not to cheers, but to expectation. This wasn't a nightclub crowd waiting for a punchline or a song. This was a room full of sponsors, hospital board members, studio lawyers, and carefully seated cameras broadcasting the event to private screens across the city. They expected Dean to be charming but distant, present but untouchable. He gave them what they wanted at first: a relaxed posture, a faint smile, hands resting easily at his sides. The image everyone knew how to read. The host stepped forward, voice polished, grateful. He spoke about generosity, about hope, about children who needed miracles more than applause. Then he glanced toward the wings and gestured gently. "And now," he said, "we'd like you to meet one of the young people you're helping tonight." The boy walked out slowly. He was thin in a way that didn't belong to fashion or neglect, but to long hospital corridors. His suit didn't quite fit. The sleeves were a touch too long, the collar stiff against his neck. He looked 9, maybe 10, but his face carried the careful seriousness of someone older, someone who had learned to listen more than speak. A microphone was placed in his hands. It was almost too heavy. His fingers tightened around it, knuckles whitening just slightly. The room smiled at him the way adults do, soft, encouraging, already assuming the shape of his words. Dean watched from a few feet away, his expression still composed. He had seen children brought on stage before. They were usually scripted, guided, protected from saying anything that might linger too long in the air. The boy lifted the microphone closer to his mouth. It trembled. "Mr. Martin," he said. The sound of his voice, quiet, steady, untrained, cut through the room more sharply than anyone expected. "My dad died last year." The smiles didn't vanish all at once. They hesitated, unsure whether this was still part of the program. A few people shifted in their seats. Somewhere near the back, a laugh started, small, nervous, and then stopped, as if choked off by the silence around it. The boy didn't look at the audience. He was looking only at Dean. "Could you be my dad?" he continued, swallowing once. "Just for one day?" The pause that followed wasn't dramatic. It was dangerous. The camera found Dean's face instantly. His familiar, practiced smile disappeared without effort, as if it had never truly belonged to him. His eyes stayed on the boy, unblinking. His shoulders stiffened, not defensively, but with attention. The host took a half-step forward, instinctively sensing the floor give way beneath the evening's careful plan. He opened his mouth, ready to soften the moment, to wrap it in humor or redirect it toward applause. But there was nowhere to redirect it now. The room fell into a silence so complete it seemed to press inward. No coughing, no clinking glasses, just the quiet awareness that everyone was watching the same man, asking the same question without words. If Dean joked, the child would hear it forever. If he refused, the cruelty would echo louder than any headline. If he agreed, even lightly, the promise would not belong to him alone anymore. Dean didn't move. He didn't reach for the microphone. He didn't look toward the host. He didn't glance at the cameras. He stood there, under the lights, with a boy waiting in front of him and an entire industry holding its breath, realizing at the same time that this wasn't a sweet moment. It was a trap with no elegant exit. Let us know where you're watching from. and we hope you enjoy the story. The host felt the silence turning against him. He cleared his throat and tried to lean into familiarity, the kind of humor that usually loosened rooms like this. With a half-smile, he glanced at Dean and said, lightly, "Careful, Dean. Hollywood might hold you to that." A few people laughed, not because it was funny, but because laughter was safer than stillness. The joke landed and slid off the floor without leaving a mark. It didn't lift the weight. It made it heavier. Now the moment had been named without being resolved, and everyone could feel the strain in the air sharpen. From somewhere near the front, a woman's voice cut through, unplanned and too sincere to be polite. "It's just one day." She hadn't meant to challenge anyone. She meant to help. But the words did the opposite. They reduced the question to something manageable, something small, as if time itself were the only cost. A few heads nodded instinctively, grateful for the simplicity of it. Dean didn't look toward her. He was watching the boy. The child hadn't shifted his feet. He hadn't adjusted the microphone. He wasn't crying or smiling or trying to be brave for the room. He stood with his shoulders slightly forward, as if leaning into a wind no one else could feel. His eyes stayed on Dean, steady, unblinking, waiting. That was what unsettled Dean most. There was no pressure in the boy's posture, no attempt to pull sympathy from the audience. He wasn't asking again. He wasn't bargaining. He had asked once, clearly, and now he was prepared to accept whatever came back. To Dean, it felt less like a request and more like a hand extended and held in place, not to force contact, but to make the refusal visible if it came. At the edge of the stage, his agent caught his eye and made the smallest possible movement. A single shake of the head. Barely noticeable. The kind of signal that had saved Dean from countless complications over the years. "Don't do this." The room began to tilt emotionally, slowly, subtly. People stopped watching Dean to see what he would do, and started watching the boy to see what he would lose. Sympathy shifted its weight. The center of gravity moved. Dean sensed it immediately. He understood crowds. He understood timing. He knew that if he waited much longer, someone else would step in. A sponsor, a board member, the host again. Someone would reframe the moment for him, turn it into something safer and smaller. And whatever answer came then would belong to them, not to him. The silence stretched. It no longer felt empty. It felt crowded with expectation. Dean drew a slow breath, careful not to make it visible. His jaw tightened slightly, not from tension, but from restraint. He was aware of how easily a word could slip out, how natural it would be to say yes, and let the night carry him forward on a wave of approval. But he also knew how hollow that kind of yes could be. He looked down briefly, then back at the boy. In that fraction of a second, something settled inside him. Not relief, not certainty. Something firmer. The understanding that saying nothing was no longer neutral. Silence, he realized, was already doing harm. The camera stayed on him longer than television etiquette allowed. Dean Martin didn't rush to fill the space. He didn't lift a hand, didn't soften his face for reassurance. From the outside, he looked almost unchanged. Still, contained, composed in the way people expected from him. The same man who never seemed hurried, never seemed pinned down. But inside, the noise was precise. He wasn't weighing applause against backlash. That calculation would have been easy. What he was measuring was something far less visible. The difference between a gesture and a responsibility. Between being kind in public and being accountable in private. He understood, with an uncomfortable clarity, that the boy hadn't asked for imagination. He hadn't asked Dean to pretend. There was no fantasy in the request. It was stripped of decoration, reduced to a single unit of time. One day, finite, defined, a boundary, not an opening. That mattered. Dean had spent much of his life avoiding promises that blurred at the edges. He had learned early that vague kindness was dangerous. It invited expectations you couldn't later meet without becoming the villain. He had watched men make generous statements they couldn't sustain, watched admiration curdle into resentment when reality followed. He refused to become one of them. A flicker of something older passed through him, not a memory with faces or voices, but a physical sensation. The feeling of being young and alert, of understanding that no one was coming to steady the ground beneath you, of realizing that reliability wasn't loud. It was quiet, repetitive, often unseen. That knowledge had shaped him more than success ever did. Dean knew what he could not offer. He could not step into a role that carried history, blood, permanence. He could not replace a man whose absence was already carved into the child's life. To suggest otherwise, even for an evening, would be dishonest. And dishonesty, dressed up as compassion, was worse than refusal. But he also knew what he could offer. Presence. Not the kind that posed for photographs or lingered under praise. The kind that arrived when expected and stayed until it was no longer needed. The kind that didn't explain itself afterward. He felt his breathing slow. His shoulders loosened almost imperceptibly. The decision wasn't emotional. It was deliberate. He would not save the moment. He would not rescue himself. And he would not perform an answer meant to satisfy everyone in the room. He would answer only the person who had asked. Dean lifted his eyes fully to the boy again. The child hadn't moved. He was still there, still waiting, still holding the microphone like it was an anchor, not hopeful, not defeated, simply present. That steadiness confirmed what Dean already knew. Whatever came next would need to be real, or it would be nothing at all. The room, the cameras, the industry, all of it faded slightly at the edges as he leaned into that clarity. He understood the risk. He accepted that there would be consequences he couldn't predict. But for the first time that evening, he felt no urge to escape the moment. The answer had already taken shape inside him. He just hadn't said it yet. Dean Martin did not answer from where he stood. Instead, he stepped forward and lowered himself until he was no longer towering above the child. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, and it unsettled the room more than any spoken refusal would have. A man known for distance had closed it, not toward the audience, but toward one boy. He rested on one knee, close enough that the cameras had to adjust, close enough that the moment no longer belonged to the stage. The microphone caught only fragments of sound now, breath more than words. What mattered was not how it would play on the broadcast, but that the boy could hear him clearly. Dean met his eyes, not gently, honestly. He didn't smile. He didn't soften the truth to make it easier. His voice stayed low, steady, carrying none of the rhythm people associated with his performances. "I can't be your father," he said quietly. The sentence landed without drama. No gasp, no ripple. Just a stillness that felt heavier for its restraint. The boy didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He absorbed the words, processing them with the same seriousness he had brought to the question. Dean waited. He didn't rush to fill the space. He had already decided that whatever came next would not be layered on top of a half-heard truth. Then he continued. "But," he said, after a pause that allowed the first sentence to settle fully, "I can spend a day with you." not a promise shaped for applause, not a concession. "One day," he repeated clearly. "No cameras, no stage, no one watching." He made sure the boundary was firm before the kindness. "Not as someone taking your dad's place," he added, "and not as a favor for anyone else in this room." His gaze didn't flicker toward the audience when he said it. He kept it where it belonged. Just as someone who shows up, stays, and leaves when the day is done. For the first time, the boy reacted. Not with relief, not with gratitude, but with caution. His fingers tightened slightly around the microphone. He studied Dean's face, as if checking for something hidden behind the words. A trick, a performance, an adult's version of kindness that evaporated the next morning. Dean didn't reassure him. He waited. That waiting did something profound. It shifted the balance. The answer was no longer being offered. It was being evaluated. Seconds passed. The room held its breath again, but differently now. This silence wasn't demanding. It was respectful. No one dared interrupt it. The boy gave a small nod. It was almost nothing. A brief dip of the chin, restrained, as though he didn't want to risk hoping too loudly. But it was enough. It was acceptance. Dean nodded back once. No handshake. No embrace. No attempt to seal the moment with affection. He rose smoothly to his feet, creating distance again, but the right kind this time, the kind that honored what had just been agreed to. There was no applause. People shifted, unsure whether they were allowed to respond at all. This wasn't a scene that invited noise. It didn't belong to them. Dean stepped back into his place on the stage, already withdrawing from the center of attention. The boy was gently guided off to the side, still quiet, still composed, carrying something new that didn't need to be named. What had happened didn't feel heroic. It didn't feel inspirational in the way charity events preferred. It felt precise. And that precision was what made it irreversible. For a few seconds after Dean stepped back, nothing happened at all. No one clapped. No one spoke. The silence lingered in the room like a held note that had nowhere to resolve. People looked at one another, searching for cues, for permission to react. This was not the kind of moment they had practiced responding to. There was no signal for approval, no emotional release built into the program. The director in the control booth made the first move. Instinct overruled ceremony. The camera pulled away from the stage and settled on a wide shot of the room, as if distance could neutralize what had just taken place. The broadcast shifted to safer faces, polite expressions, composed donors, hands folded neatly in laps. Dean noticed, but he didn't respond to it. He had already stepped back from the frame in a more permanent way. He stood with his weight evenly distributed, hands relaxed, eyes forward, not expectant, not defensive, as if the evening could continue now, because the only moment that truly mattered had passed. In the audience, reactions arrived unevenly. Some people felt unsettled, not because they were unmoved, but because they were. They had witnessed something that refused to be categorized. It wasn't uplifting in the usual sense. It offered no easy takeaway, no polished line to repeat later. It asked nothing of them. And that, somehow, made it heavier. A few executives leaned subtly toward one another, exchanging looks that carried no judgment, only recognition. This could not be packaged. It could not be replayed without losing its substance. There would be no follow-up interviews, no press-friendly version. Whatever had just happened existed only for those who had been present. That alone made it dangerous. Near the back of the room, a man whose name carried weight, someone accustomed to rooms bending slightly when he entered them, tilted his head and spoke under his breath to the person beside him. "That was real," he said. The words didn't travel far. They didn't need to. Dean didn't hear them. Or perhaps he did, and chose not to acknowledge them. He had no interest in validation now. He had already given the only answer that required anything of him. The host returned to the stage with careful professionalism. His voice regained its practiced warmth as he redirected the evening back towards safer ground. Donations, gratitude, a scheduled performance. The machinery of the event resumed, slightly off balance, but intact. Yet something had shifted. People listened differently. Applause came slower, more measured. Laughter, when it appeared, felt cautious. It was as if the room had been reminded, briefly, that not everything meaningful announces itself loudly. Dean exited the stage without ceremony. No glance over his shoulder. No acknowledgement of the audience beyond a courteous nod. He moved through the side corridor with the same unhurried pace he always used. But there was a subtle change in how people watched him pass. Not admiration. Respect. In the hall beyond the lights, his agent fell into step beside him. There were no congratulations, no warnings. Just a quiet exhale, as though a tension he hadn't known how to name had finally been released. Dean didn't speak. He didn't need to explain what he had done, or why. Explanation would have pulled the moment back into the world of performance, and he was finished performing. Behind him, the event carried on, but something essential had already left the room with him, something that refused to be applauded, edited, or owned, and that, more than anything, unsettled the system that had learned to control almost everything else. No article appeared the next morning. Not in the trades, not in the gossip columns, not even in the small society blurbs that usually documented who wore what and who donated how much. The broadcast recording existed, of course, but the moment itself didn't survive in a form the world could consume. The director had cut away. The microphones had caught only pieces. There was nothing clean enough to sell. And Dean Martin didn't offer anything to fill the gaps. There was no follow-up quote from his publicist, no heartwarming statement, no arranged photo of Dean with the boy for a hospital newsletter. The foundation didn't turn the exchange into a campaign because they couldn't. It would have felt like stealing something that didn't belong to them. So the story moved the way certain true things move, quietly, person to person, without proof. A nurse mentioned it to a friend at a coffee counter weeks later, not as gossip, but as something she still couldn't quite hold in her mind. A stagehand told his wife, and she told her sister. And it passed along with a kind of reverence people usually saved for private funerals and long marriages. Each retelling was careful. It didn't need embellishment. It had already been sharp enough. The day itself remained mostly invisible. There were no reporters outside a restaurant, no flash bulbs in a parking lot, no rumor of a limousine pulling up for a photo opportunity. Whatever Dean did, he did it as he had promised. Away from the stage, away from anyone eager to witness him being good. That is why, for years, the details never solidified into something cinematic. Some people claimed they saw them at a small diner in the valley, the kind with chipped mugs and a waitress who didn't care who you were. Others insisted it was a quiet walk near the ocean, a place where the wind could erase footsteps quickly. Another version said they spent time in a record store, Dean letting the boy pick out albums like it was an ordinary Saturday. None of these accounts could be confirmed. That was the point. What did become consistent, repeated with the same simple certainty across different mouths, was a single sentence spoken by someone who had no reason to invent it. He kept his word, a hospital staffer said years later, when asked carefully, almost reluctantly, quietly. Not, he changed the boy's life. Not, he saved him. Not, he made headlines. Just that. Kept his word. There was something grown up about the way the story ended. It didn't demand a climax. It didn't insist on a dramatic transformation or a permanent bond. It didn't rewrite grief into happiness. It left grief where it belonged, real, persistent, part of the child's life. But it added one clean, separate memory beside it. A day when someone showed up and stayed. For the boy, that mattered in a way adults often forget. Children don't need grand declarations as much as they need consistency. Not someone who promises forever, but someone who doesn't disappear mid-sentence. For Dean, the effect was quieter, but no less permanent. He had spent years protecting himself with distance, letting the world assume he was unreachable so it couldn't ask too much of him. That night, under the weight of a question he couldn't joke away, he had chosen a different kind of control. Not control over the room, but over his own integrity. He refused to turn the child into a symbol. He refused to turn himself into a savior. He refused to let the industry translate a private act into a public product. And that refusal is exactly why the story survived. In a town built on being seen, he did something that required disappearing. In an era that rewarded spectacle, he chose restraint. He gave the boy the only thing he could offer without lying, his presence, then stepped out of the narrative before anyone could claim it. Decades later, when people spoke of Dean Martin, they still spoke of the voice, the ease, the Rat Pack glamour. But among those who had heard the story, truly heard it, the memory carried a different weight. Not a legend on a stage. A man who understood that the most honorable kindness is the kind that doesn't ask to be witnessed. And when the story ends, it doesn't end with applause. It ends the way it began, inside a silence that feels full, a silence that lasts a few seconds longer than expected, because some part of you doesn't want to break it.